So, hello everyone, and welcome to our event today, the book seminar on Alessandro Ferrara's latest book. It's called Sovereignty Across Generations, Political Liberalism and Constituent Power. And Alessandro, our distinguished guest, is not here for the first time. As some of you may remember, a minority in this room, Alessandro was here in early December 2014 for the first time when we had a book seminar on his previous book called The Democratic Horizon, Hyperpluralism and the Renewal of Political Liberalism, if I'm correct. In fact, this event was pioneering in the sense that it was the first book seminar that we've had at this institute of this kind. So it was groundbreaking in a way, and as it turned out, this format became very fruitful. I would even dare say it became the most fruitful format of academic events that we have had at this institute for the past decade. So many book seminars followed in the footsteps of this first one. And now, almost a decade later, Alessandro has returned with a new book, I would say even more ambitious, which carries further his project. So let me just briefly introduce Alessandro for all of you who see him for the first time, and then we will start the discussion. Alessandro Ferrara was professor of political philosophy at the University of Rome Tor Vergata until last year, and he now teaches legal theory at the LUISS University in Rome and political theory at Loyola University, the Rome Center. He is former president of the Italian Association for Political Philosophy and the founder and co-director of the annual Conference on Philosophy and Social Sciences in Prague. This was formerly the conference held at the Inter-University Center of Dubrovnik, established by Jürgen Habermas in 1975. Then, after the unfortunate events of 1991, the conference moved first for 1 year to the island of Ischia, if I remember correctly, and then from 1993 on, it has been held in Prague. Since 2007, Ferrara has also been on the executive committee of the Istanbul Seminars on Religion and Politics, held under the auspices of the association Reset Dialogues of Civilizations. He has also served as editorial consultant on the board of a number of journals, including Constellations, Philosophy and Social Criticism, Crisis, and the European Journal of Philosophy. He is a co-founder of the Italian Seminar on Critical Theory. Ferrara received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley as a Harkness Fellow, and he conducted research with Jürgen Habermas as a Humboldt Fellow in Munich and Frankfurt. He has lectured in numerous universities and institutions, including Harvard, Columbia, Yale University New School for Social Research, University College London, Oxford, the Chinese Academy of Social Science, and many others. Ferrara's earlier works, such as Reflective Authenticity, 1998, and The Force of the Example, 2008, developed an account of normativity centered on authenticity and exemplarity, an account which incorporates a reconstructed version of Kant's reflective judgment and is intended as an alternative both to proceduralist neo-transcendental approaches to validity and to anti-normative radical contextualism. Over the last decade, Ferrara has carried this project further with 3 books that revisit and expand John Rawls's political liberalism, so the later perspective of John Rawls, the anti-perfectionist liberal perspective of his later works. These 3 books are The Democratic Horizon, the already mentioned one that we discussed in 2014, The Democratic Horizon, Hyperpluralism and the Renewal of Political Liberalism. Then, with Frank Michelman, Legitimation by Constitution, a Dialogue on Political Liberalism, this is 2021. And the latest one, Sovereignty Across Generations, Constituent Power and Political Liberalism, came out last year with Oxford University Press. So as you can see, Ferrara has been developing a sophisticated elaboration of John Rawls's political liberalism as a framework for conceptualizing democracy in our age, facing all its huge challenges and obstacles. And in this latest book, as we will see, Ferrara develops a unique account of what he calls transgenerational sovereignty. I will not talk anymore about the book because I will give the word to Alessandro to present in a brief outline the basic arguments of the book and his motivation for writing it. But just before I give the word to Alessandro, let me just say that we have 8 discussants here today. 7 of us are from the Institute, and then we have Jelena Lončar from the Faculty of Political Sciences. Unfortunately, Irena Fiket, who was supposed to be one of the discussants, had to cancel due to health reasons. Instead of her, we have Milan Urošević here, who is now in the audience. And as I already mentioned, our colleague George Christo will join us through Zoom. So we'll have 3 rounds of commentaries. We will have first Alessandro's introduction and 1 round of comments, then a short break, and then 2 more rounds of comments. So, Alessandro, please.
Well, thank you. Very heartfelt thanks for having organized this marvelous encounter, which in a way renews an experience that I now learned was path-breaking. Very proud of that. That was a format that I found particularly congenial, because people whom I thank all of you for taking the time to go through those pages and convoluted thoughts at times and taking the time to write comments. That's how conversation works out and how ideas hopefully get improved over time. So I'm very thankful to Marianne for having organized this, and to the Institute for hosting us. And I hope I hope I learned from your comments. In a way, as an author, you understand what you really said once you get the feedback from other people. Then you realize how you should have perhaps expressed your ideas. Now, let me say something shortly about the books. The book. It is a book, Sovereignty Across Generations, that battles on many fronts. Perhaps too many, I don't know. But the best I can do is to give you an idea of the goals that motivated me in writing the book, and there are 5 of them. So the first is reflected in the subtitle, Constituent Power and Political Liberalism. For the past 15 years, as Marianne mentioned, my research has revolved around rethinking and expanding, ameliorating the paradigm of political liberalism, originally elaborated by Rawls in 1993, over 30 years ago, in a context significantly different from our own. And it's a paradigm that allows us to bring the liberal paradigm out of a defensive posture, even if, of course, the defense of rights and the rule of law are fundamental. If the contenders on the field are populism on the one hand and neoliberalism on the other, 2 formations, 2 kind of positions that have very little sympathy for rights for different reasons. Now, John Rawls's political liberalism, for me, is open to the future. It is the richest, most differentiated, and solid paradigm, not for defending what exists, but for pushing beyond the defensive line. It's a critical liberalism. It's a book about meeting the challenge of explaining better than other paradigms that do not draw on liberalism what it means for society to be free of oppression. A goal that, of course, is interesting for anyone involved in critical theory. And from countless perspectives today, think of recognition theory, Think of the post-deconstructionist, whatever has become of the deconstructionist nebula. Think of post-colonial thinking or agonistic and republican visions of democracy. All of these positions somehow, you get from them the mantra of coexistence among different people and of the mantra of equality in diversity. But none of these paradigms is capable really of breaking through generalities, invoking coexistence of in diversity. None of these paradigms is capable, as political liberalism, of telling us what specific criteria of legitimacy, what institutions, concretely, what constitutional principles need to be presupposed so that citizens with rival value orientation then may coexist without oppressing each other when they happen to have the majority on their side or through the levers of government. So in chapter 1 of the book, I reconstruct the reasons why political liberalism is the most promising paradigm for spelling out those guidelines for an oppression-free society. And I won't review these reasons here, but I'll just mention that Rawls's paradigm needs constructive updating. It's not an all finished product, but it needs expansion in 2 areas at least. One area was the one discussed 10 years ago, namely the reality of a hyperpluralism, a pluralism much more pronounced than the rift between Rousseauian and Lockean traditions. And today, we need to address a new set of challenges for political liberalism that are linked with the rise of populism and with the need to counter the democratic backsliding that populism has induced. Now, populism, right-wing and left-wing alike, is defined in chapter 2 of the book as the conflation of the people and the electorate, the people and the voters. By virtue, the attribution of full constituent power to the electorate, by virtue of its allegedly embodying the will of the people. And thirdly, by an attitude of presumptively justified intolerance against the enemies of the people, against the elites, against the self-interested politicians. And my point is that populism derives its great appeal from the fact that it reflects views of popular sovereignty that are certainly not invented during the last decade, but they're deeply seated in our political imaginary, and especially in our radical democratic tradition. So the second front on which the book battles is reconstructing this, what I call serial view of democratic sovereignty, articulating among others by Rousseau and Jefferson, certainly not populist, but now that view is hijacked by populists, right-wing and left-wing again alike, according to which each generation of a transgenerational people, each generation equals to the entire people. So the Italian people is the presently living Italian people. The Serbian people is the presently living and voting Serbian citizens. This temporally present, the presently living segment of the people is like the owner of the Constitution, of the basic structure and the list of fundamental rights and liberties, and can modify it without constraints. So the people is a series, that's why serial conception is a series of these generational segments. And political liberalism is based on the opposite view, a sequential view of popular sovereignty, according to which the electorate, the voters, is a constituted power that acts within the constitutional tracks set by the people, of which we, the voters, are also part, but not, we don't impersonate the whole. So the people is like the collective author of the Constitution. It has a transgenerational span. It doesn't last just one generation. It's all across. In some cases, decades. In other cases, centuries. It's the author of the Constitution, and its single temporal segments, we the voters, are like the co-authors of a volume. Certainly free to speak our mind in our chapter, but within a certain project. If we're writing a book in political philosophy, you don't want to have a piece on zoology or botanics. We have a project, and within that project, you're free to say what you want. Same relation to we the voters, we the temporally presently living segment of a people, and the people in general in its transgenerational span. So the voters' will cannot count, that's the upshot, cannot count as the will of the people. It's just our will, but it's not the will of the people if it clashes with the project inscribed in the Constitution as interpreted not by the self-interested voters, but as interpreted by a referee, historically, but by no means necessarily a judicial institution. It could be another institution, distinct from the potentially self-interested voters and their elected representatives. Now, for a long time, these two conceptions, the serial and the sequential, have been misleadingly described as a democratic, radical democratic view and a liberal view of popular sovereignty. And so a third item on the agenda of the book is to question this picture and to recast the contest of a serial and a sequential view of popular sovereignty, not as a democratic and a liberal approach, but as the clash of two equally democratic views, only one of which, the sequential, really makes full sense. And the reasons why the other one, the serial view, even if it vaunts the honorific titles often of radical democracy, of republicanism, makes less sense, the reasons why are three. And you find them in chapter 5. Perhaps somebody will take that up. If you go for a serial view of democratic sovereignty, then three unwelcome consequences are the possibility, first, of a volatile, or what I call a wanton republic, prone to changing its basic structure and essentials at each generation. And that becomes a possibility. And if it so happens it deprives the Constitution of all regulatory function, reduces the Constitution to a mere rhetorical amplification of the will of the voters. You might as well not have a Constitution, just call it the will of the electorate. Second, insofar as the people's political project for self-government fails to stabilize over time because the Constitution has no transgenerational regulatory function, then the symbolic basis of the people's identity may recede along ethnocultural lines with all the risks connected with that. Third, the generations of a people may fail to reach each other as equals, to treat each other as equals, and to leave to their successors enough and as good democratic sovereignty as they themselves enjoy. So Rawls simply takes for granted that the author of the Constitution is the people in its transgenerational entirety, and it leaves much work for us to do, namely to specify the reasons why. One of the consequences is that his sequential model of democratic sovereignty raises the question of what the limits are of the amending power to change the Constitution. This question then constitutes a fourth item on the book's agenda. Rawls takes the strong position that the essentials of the people's transgenerational project are not at the disposal of any single generational segment. They're implicitly unamendable. Even in the absence of eternity clauses, such as, for example, Article 139 of the Constitution of Italy or Article 89 of the Constitution of France, that both make the so-called republican form of the country, of the legal order, unamendable. Rawls's argument for the implicit unamendability, even though there is no such eternity clause, is in various ways problematic. He argues that a hypothetical amendment for the reestablishment of religion, for example, in the United States, making it a Christian nation, as about 48% of the electorate favor by the recent poll, should be rejected as invalid, such an amendment, by the Supreme Court, regardless of its compliance with the formalities of Article 5, which is the article in the Constitution that regulates amendments to the Constitution. The reason why it should be rejected as invalid is that the amendments related, so Rawls, to the Civil War and the 19th Amendment enfranchising women in 1919 were all meant to bring the Constitution more in line with its original promise. And then an amendment which is formally fine, impeccable, but yet subverts this progressive trend to the expansion of rights would amount to a disfiguring of the Constitution, a subversion of the Constitution, and as such should be rejected. Now, there are lots of problems with this Rawlsian grounding of implicit unamendability of the constitutional essentials, of the political project enshrined in the Constitution. And so a fourth front on which the book battles is to offer a better justification, a better grounding for this implicit unamendability. And I come up with the concept of vertical reciprocity. So rights and liberties cannot be curtailed. This would be the principle of vertical reciprocity, because the living citizens should not alter the constitutional essentials in a way that would make it less reasonable for future generations to be willing to live in the so reformed, so amended Constitution. So the presently living citizens, we the voters, are under the obligation to relate in terms of reciprocity to all the free and equal generations of the people, not just to our contemporaries. All right. And this sequential view raises other questions than addressed in chapter 5 and 6, basically questions of representations. We, the living citizens, are represented by members of parliament in parliamentary democracies, or by the president, where you elect in legal orders, where you elect directly the president. But who represents the past generations of the people and the future generations? You need some referee that represents those segments of the people. Traditionally, this has taken the form of a judicial institution, a supreme or constitutional court. There is no necessity in that. One could imagine a non-judicial institution. I don't get into that debate. I just take for granted that it is. I'm more interested in the function. How do you execute that function of representing past and future generations of people who are no longer there or not yet there? And more interested in how you should draw the line, this is in chapter 6, between interpreting the will of past generations or unduly transforming it, which is the task of parliament or those who have legislative power in so far. So how you draw the line between interpreting and transforming, and how you can make that refereeing statement, how can you can have an appeal against it? How you can make it not absolutely final, which would establish a kind of judicial supremacy over the people's will. And finally, the last point for Rawls, not only the power to change the Constitution is normatively constrained, in this case by the essentials of the will of the people, but also, and this is what is distinctive of his view of constituent power, also the first rate, let's say, constituent power to create in legal order. Also, that is not unbound, differently than a tradition that goes from CAA all the way to Carl Schmitt, where the legal order is just the product of the unconstrained will of this constitution-making power. Not so for Rawls, who quotes John Locke as the only forerunner of his view of constituent power. And we know that Locke had a view of natural rights. So the people have what he called a supreme power to create an order, the commonwealth. But certainly the people cannot create a commonwealth which is oblivious to the natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Cannot create a commonwealth, a well-ordered commonwealth without rights to property and all of that. Now, so it is a constituent power which is constrained by some rights. And for Rawls, it's the same thing, with the exception that that thing which limits constituent power cannot be natural rights, because natural rights are something metaphysical in his parlance, not political. So, but what is then that limits constituent power for Rawls? This is the task of chapter 3, to reconstruct it. And one could be tempted to say that it is justice as fairness, his view of justice, that constrains constituent power. But that interpretation is precluded by footnote 7 to lecture 2 of Political Liberalism. I advise everyone to take a look at that tiny footnote, because in a footnote, it expresses the distance that exists between Political Liberalism 1993 and Theory of Justice 1971. We need to reach for an answer to the question, what limits constituent power, to Rawls's dual standard of the reasonable introduced in Political Liberalism, alongside the idea that we're familiar with, that for something to be reasonable, constitutional essential, a platform for a party, a project for a constitution, for anything to be reasonable means to be endorsable by a loyal cooperator mindful of the burdens of judgment, respectful of the burden of judgment. And then, as of 1980, he envisaged that something, again, a constitution, a basic structure, a political conception of justice, could be most reasonable for us. Where what makes something just reasonable, then most reasonable for us, somehow relates to central aspects of who we are. Justice as fairness acquires the qualification of most reasonable for us, as he puts it, given our history and the traditions embedded in our public life, and thanks to its congruence with our deeper understanding of ourselves and our aspirations. So the normativity that binds constituent power, then, back to the point, emanates from justice as fairness, yes, but not justice as fairness as in Theory of Justice, as the outcome of this thought experiment, the original position, namely as the view of justice most rational to hold for any human being, but justice as fairness in its second capacity, as the most reasonable conception of justice for us. In this view of the constraining force, the kind of constraining factors of constituent power is articulated in chapter 3 and brought into a dialogue with Kelsen and Schmitt, two major clashing titans of 20th century constitutional thought. And when you look at them, this is the contribution somehow that Rawls brings to this continental discussion. When you look at Kelsen and Schmitt from the angle of political liberalism, you realize that they're just two irrelevant, diverse variety of the same thing, namely kind of legal positivism in the case of Kelsen, and a political positivism, political realism in the case of Schmitt. But in both cases, there's no foothold, no normative foothold for questioning the product, the result of the exercise of constituent power. Not so for Rawls, where you could say, yes, you exercised constituent power, but you missed the most reasonable conception for us. You made a mistake. That constitution is suboptimal with respect to what it could be. There's no way you could say that from a Kelsenian or a Schmittian perspective. And that is a truly normative kind of view without relapsing into a Lockean type idea of metaphysicized natural rights. Much work remains to be done, of course, and we're here to listen to advice and feedback on that extra work that needs to be done to reconstruct this view of liberalism, which is not oblivious to constituent power, which is looked at with great diffidence and as almost as anathema by other major liberal democratic thinkers. Think of Habermas, think of Ronald Dworkin. They would stay away from constituent power like hell, like a threat. Not so Rawls, which measures up to it and tames it somehow from this kind of Schmittian self-assertive, unauthorized expression of existential political power to something that responds to normativity. And we need to fill out the other details of the picture. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alessandro. That was a wonderful summary of a very, very complex book and complex argument. And now let's get into details, and as you say, try to just have a better grasp of how heuristically fruitful this perspective is and how much it contributes to many of the pressing issues of our day. We have, as I said, a variety of discussants here. Some of them are political thinkers, political theorists, others sociologists or critical theorists in some sense. I hope they give differentiated contributions to that project. So we start with three contributors. We have Michal Sladeček here from the Institute, we have Jelena Lončar from the Faculty of Political Science, and we have Marko Konjović also from the Institute. Michal, the floor is yours.
I'm first speaker, but anyway, this is my comment and question will be very specific. So I would like to challenge, or not challenge, that review your interpretation of Dworkin along with concepts of the coherence. So my first point considers Dworkin's, or better to say Dworkinian, understanding of the transgeneration people and the role of coherence. People or personified community in Dworkin terminology, and this community can be conceived as a transgenerational as well, is created by law as integrity, which instruct judges to identify legal rights and duties so far as possible on the assumption that they were created by a single author. Legal rules are part of social practices, and then their interpretation is not confined to judges and legal theorists. Anyone reflecting on the law must aim at aspirational coherence on constructive interpretation. So the question is what we as the people or as the nation across the historical time are intended to be in accordance with our constitution or political and legal institutions which we share through generations. You notice that coherence arguments are all affected by a blind spot. Designed to make regressive change illegitimate, they end up making progressive change, e.g. the democratization of the authoritarian constitution, equally difficult to justify. And you continue that Rawls offered a progressivistic theological version of the coherence argument, with all these flaws. Insisting on coherence with pre-existing laws makes it difficult to amend unacceptable, obsolete constitutional clauses, but it is not the only kind of coherence we can consider. In accordance with Dworkin's position, the justification of amendments to the constitutions can be provided if we understand them as the organized and coherent voice of what he refers to as a community of people. Members of which understand themselves as free and equal. Also, they can understand themselves in the unity of a common faith, as transgenerational sequential people integrated through rights and responsibilities. Sequential popular sovereignty is realizable by interpreting the amendments in coherence with constitutional principles in the sense of speaking with one voice, in this case, in the voice of transgeneration people. Contrary to Joseph Rath's interpretation of integrity as coherence in the act of legislative bodies as fixed at once and for all, integrity in Dworkin's sense means the interpretation of those acts in continuous interaction over time. Integrity in its historical dimension as well as the coherence stemming from it lead us to the interpretation of the transgenerational sovereignty that include the past intentions and future aspirations, alongside the will of the living people. As Dworkin noticed, when reasoning about constitutional principles, we are required to consider them as an interpretive social practices and to offer interpretation of what it requires in light of the purpose or point which they assign to it. The rules of legal practice can be revised in light of the purpose or point of this practice. And interpretations of principles given by judges and legal theorists very depend on them. Aspirational means what we are intended to be. Its purpose in standing to attain certain points, such as principles of justice, fairness, equality, and the procedural due process. And this includes the commitment to some future achievements and not to be the hostage of the past. So my question is there any crucial difference between integrity of coherence in Dworkin's sense, the aim of which is to provide formally, but more importantly, morally, the best set of sound principles on which the Constitution rests through history, and Rawls' understanding of more reasonable interpretation, which rests on oriented reflective judgment? My second comment and question are concerned with the background culture as a pertinent but insufficiently elaborated part of Rawls' political liberalism. I assume that the main reason for it is in contrasting public forum with background culture, and in the latter case, we are on non-political ground. However, the political theory, including Rawls' political liberalism, is required to give an account of the background culture supportive for liberal democratic constitution, or more important, on account of non-supportive background, which is relevant in time of rising populism. The quality of education, standards of objectivity and impartiality of information, media presentations, cultural life, familiar relationships, non-governmental organization, and citizens' interest groups, and many other social issues. Roughly speaking, any of those elements of background culture can have a liberal or illiberal sign. Can be the pillar bolstering liberal institutions or be conducive to their dismantling. If the Constitution is comprehended by Rawls as a vision rather than a set of rules, is it the vital, functional, diversified, and autonomous background culture, therefore a precondition for such a constitution? Evidently, there are historical records that amendments of constitutions originated in the cultural and social transformation. The extension of equal rights to women, races, and working class has generally been incited by non-political associations. For example, abolitionist movements in the United States and in the United Kingdom, as well as British Labour Party, are formed by religious organizations. Extensions has been established from moral principles which become prominent in background culture or in overall ethos, at least on the relevant part of the population. Without this newly predominated background of ethos, it is questionable if the newly acknowledged rights could be established as a part of law. As it is well known, communitarians emphasize the priority of cultural, communal, social basis of legal political order or habits and ethical life, which has been widely criticized by political liberalism as a feature of pre-political associations inadequate for the large-scale national state. From the other hand, communitarians warned that this void of ethical and cultural sustenance in the absence of liberals' interest in non-political spheres of culture and ethical life will be filled by right-wing traditionalism and nowadays even more by extremist populist ideology. Communitarian theoreticians can claim that the electorate identified with the people is just one aspect of populism, and it has emerged as a consequence of decaying background culture. Let's quickly have a very local example. During a relatively short period in Serbia from year 2000 to 2012, with a moderately liberal democratic government in the situation of cohabitation of several parties, the Department of Education and Department of Culture were almost always appointed to right-wing, conservative, anti-European nationalist parties. Culture and education were for liberals less relevant departments of government, but not for parties with a conservative social agenda, the consequence of which is present-day corrupted politics, public forum and public space in general, with clericalization, authoritarianism, xenophobia, and so on. Background culture is in flux, and as it is demonstrated in its degradation in Serbia in the last decades. This devastation, of course, is salient not only in Serbia, but recently in many other European and non-European countries as well. I don't know if I have time for one more comment.
Yes, yes.
All right. So my final point concerned the divergence and convergence of the constitutional norms and principles between various liberal democratic countries. As you notice, Rawls in introduction to the paperback edition of Political Liberalism for the first time envisages a well-ordered liberal society to possibly be home, not just to a reasonable pluralism of comprehensive doctrines, but also to a family of reasonable liberal political conceptions of justice, some of which may be not only different, but even incompatible. And I am unsure how can they be incompatible. Isn't incompatibility maybe too strong term? By accepting different but reasonable conceptions of justice, are those societies divergent slightly from the same or very similar model, or are they become considerably different, as the term incompatibility suggests? Anyway, this remained cryptic to me, as does the next Rawls passage. We may even imagine liberal democratic societies in which political conceptions of justice other than justice as fairness may be deemed the most reasonable. To be honest, I cannot imagine them distinctly. Rawls reiterates this claim in several passages without giving an example of just liberal democratic societies not based on similar principles. So I could only instantiate some examples of deviation from the liberal model of departures from that basic moral principles of the well-ordered liberal societies. Singapore must be an exemplary of decent liberal democratic state, but the death sentence practiced for trafficking of drugs less harmful than alcohol, such as cannabis, and a minimum of 1 year imprisonment for possessing is a cruel and unusual punishment, illegitimate from the standards of some liberal constitutional clauses, such as the 8th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. Is it a variation or severe deviation from a liberal democratic scheme founded on political liberalism? Also, US Supreme Court recent overturn of the federal abortion rights could be regarded as an example of non-liberal practice in progressive liberal state. In contrast, currently in France, the right to abortion is amended as a constitutional right. Are those societies becoming more divergent between themselves through amending the constitutions? Are they based on liberalism different as a sort, or as they just variation?
Thanks, Nico. Our second discussant is Jana.
I'd like to speak a bit about representation, if that's fine. I think this is important, as the only way people can exercise their sovereignty is through representation, and maybe more attention could be paid to it in this discussion. Now, in order for us to assess the quality of interpretation of the Constitution, we need to know, I'd say, what interests of the people are and the electorate, and what the criteria for measuring the quality are. And I think, for me, it was a bit challenging to establish a link between chapters 5 and chapter 6, in a sense that in chapter 5 discusses representation theory or theories and their contributions, and the way, and then chapter 6 speaks about representation of the people. And I haven't really seen the use of representation theories from chapter 5 in developing the arguments for representation of the people. And I think sometimes the arguments overlap. So that's 2 points I'd like to speak about. The first one is related to interest. As I mentioned, the second one is related to what good representation is. You seem to endorse Pitkin's understanding of representation and her substantive representation, which means acting for the interests of the people. For her, I think this is something that at least contemporary representation theory, and you mentioned Saber, but not only him. It starts from the representative turn in the 90s with Nadia Urbinati, Mansbridge, as you mentioned her as well. And that's this understanding of interest as true, transparent, and essentialist. There's a long discussion about whether representatives are delegates or trustees, but Pitkin concludes this, I think, very clearly. I can even quote her. She says whether the representative ought to act in his interests, in his constituents' interest as he sees it, or as they see it. Both formulations distort. He must act in their interest, period. Their view of their interests may or may not be definitive, depending on the issue and the situation. But if he follows it, it should be because the action accords with their interests, not because they may think it does. But the main debate is not whether a representative is a trustee or a delegate, but whoever he is, should act in the interests of either the electorate or the people, if we're speaking about the court. Now, when I translate this to the interpretation, right, that's the role of the courts, to interpret the Constitution, I wonder whether interpretation doesn't partially includes creation as well. Can interpretation of the Constitution be objective? And I think you also say it's not really objective, in a sense that you cannot step in the same Constitution twice, right, as mentioned in the book. Now, this is a sort of recognition that the way we read the Constitution always depends on the position we stand in, or the time, right, who we are, where the society is. And I think the judges interpreting the Constitution can also be influenced by politics, or what's going on in the country, by public opinions, by other institutions, such as the parliament or the government. And I don't think that we can say that their interpretation of the Constitution or the interests of the past and future generations is not necessarily objective. How can we at the same time recognize and reconcile these two issues, saying that we cannot step in the same Constitution twice, and at the same time still speak about interests as objective, and also speak about the most reasonable interpretations, because these are then objective categories, while at the same time having this more constructivist understanding of the role of the representative. Now, I don't think keeping Pitkin's understanding of representation puts us in the very essentialist position, which means that the representatives can truly and objectively determine the interest of the constituents, wherever they are. This would mean that the judges should be able to determine the true interests of past generations, the current generations, the electorate, and the future generations. Now, I'm not sure we can really do this. In thinking about the future generations, can we really know what the interests of these generations are? thinking also about the past generations, can we also reflect on the past objectively, independently from the current society we live in, or the challenges we live in? Now, I think this challenges Pitkin's understanding of representation, and adding both Mansbridge and Sayward, but also Reffeld, not so much Reffeld, but Sayward and Mansbridge later, I think helps reframe Pitkin's position and leave these very essential issues. I think that's one of the things. And I think Sayward says this very clearly, that representatives do not merely provide information, but they also tell their audience what they should care about. They also create these interests. I think this involves not only the representatives of the electorate in the chapter 5, but also representatives of the people from chapter 6. I think the representatives have this role, at least to partially create and change the opinions and preferences of the audience. I think they also tell us how we should understand the interests of the people. And this is not merely their interpretation of the interests, objective interpretation, but also their co-creation of these interests. And then I think Sayward says this: by following Pitkin too closely, we stand to lose a sense of continuity and the strong element of dynamic constructiveness of representative politics, along with the importance of those who do constructing across a variety of democratic and other contexts. And then the second thing also relates to Pitkin, right? Acting in the interest. What does it mean to act responsively in the interest of the people? I was hoping to find the answer to the question, which I'm not sure there was a clear answer to. What does it mean to represent well?
To represent the people.
Well, the people. The argument is the most reasonable.
Yeah.
It's the most reasonable. But what makes certain interpretation the most reasonable? And you argued today that it needs to be endorsable. Now, I think even constructivists who don't have this normative position would say that there are certain conditions under which consent needs to be given for it to be legitimate. Right? Now, if the author of the Constitution, the people, seems to accept the interpretation by the court, and if there is no objection, I don't think it necessarily means that the author of the Constitution is either happy, and I wouldn't say that silence is necessarily a sign of agreement. So if in a society there is no objection to what the court says, it does not mean that we cannot, I'm not sure we can still frame it as good representation. And I think that the book, Hirschman's book from the 1970s on voice, exit, and loyalty, I think is very useful here in that sense. Because sometimes silence may not be acceptance. It can also be, it can also mean that the people don't feel that their voice matters, or that they can speak. And then exploring more of these conditions under which consent is given, I think, would be needed. And Mansbridge, who you mentioned in chapter 5, would then be also useful, at least in a sense that she discusses this deliberative accountability and these conditions under which the people, well, discussion between the representatives and the constituents, wherever they are. And she criticizes Pitkin for speaking about responsiveness and accountability only in terms of election. And she would say, well, it's not enough to have someone who is authorized or accountable. There needs to be account giving and holding to account in every moment of each of the decisions. But then we also need some conditions under which the people hold representatives to account, such as pluralism or transparency or media freedom or whatever. And I would also say that can a child and Karen Sellis, they write about representation of women, feminist political representation, and they were trying to also develop these conditions under which representation is good. Susan Dowey writes about good representation as well. Now, Sarah Childs and Karen Sellis speak about the three conditions under which this acceptance of claims can be treated as legitimate, and they write about inclusiveness, egalitarianism, and responsiveness. In a sense that those who are acted upon should also be included in the decision making. The process should be egalitarian in the sense that everyone who has something to say is treated equally and different conditions. I wonder what is this useful at all. Ian, I would like to hear your reflections on this. And I'd also say that, Saber, for instance, he discusses this consent, which you write about in chapter 5, and he says that claims need to be recognized and accepted as legitimate by the audience to be representative. And I think this is something similar as well in chapter 6. My suggestion is to understand the relation between the people and the Constitution, and also Supreme Court, as the conversion of an author and its interpreter over the meaning and version of record. When presented with the interpretations, the author may tacitly accept the interpretation offered, but they may also reject it. I think Saber writes the same. He says the same thing. Every representative claim can be also contested. There's always, that's power, the issue of power. There's always, and this is what he writes about when he says the representation is relational, which Pitkin does not recognize. It means that it works both ways, from the representative to the represented, and in the opposite direction. And then he would say that relations range considerably more widely, since every representative claim presupposes the possibility of a counterclaim. There is no representation without openness to counterclaim. The claim is always at risk of being contested or rejected by the would-be constituency or audience, which in a plural democracy includes other political parties. When making a claim, a representative invites the audience to accept her as their representative, and the claim made about and for them as something in which they view themselves. And I think since representation includes the active making of what is to be represented and the contestation of claims, representation should be seen as dynamic, ongoing relationship among various actors, rather than merely aligning with Pitkin's unidirectional understanding of very objective view of representation. So maybe I even can see in chapter 6, if I read it right, that the more constructivist understanding fits well with your understanding of representation, in the sense you understand interpretation. And another thing is, when you say that the problem is that the people is a construction and the really living people are only the judges and the electorate, I would say that also representation theory can be useful here, particularly the constructivists, when they write about the political and cultural background, because I think the political and cultural background ensures the presence of the people in a certain way, in a sense that, here's a quote, although representation has a constitutive force, representatives cannot simply conjure claims out of the air. That's what Saylor would say. What they need to do to make their claims accepted by the audience is they need to make them understandable to the constituency in a way to rely on the cultural context and pre-giving understanding. I think this is what also determines or affects what is or is not claimable and how the claim is likely to affect the audience. And this is, in a sense, the representatives will always have to rely on the past understanding of politics or political issues or whatever. This is what Saylor calls cultural and political background. But this background creates our understanding of the present. And the fact also, so even when the representatives are trying to construct or create a new understanding of the Constitution or whatever else, they need to rely on our past understanding, so that they can never make a fully new claim, because they will be hard to be accepted by the electorate, because we are raised in a certain culture. Okay. And just a minor issue, the electorate should not alter constitutional essentials. We should say, I wonder, why are the people, the constituents, in constitutional matters? And I know that you write that sometimes even the parliament can represent the people, but I wonder, are there other issues that affect future generations equally strong as the constitutional essentials, such as environment-related policies, or in the case of Serbia, some of the issues related to Kosovo, the essentials, for instance, and how we deal with this. Why is the electorate in charge here rather than the people, for instance? Why is the electorate the main constituency in these issues, in the issues of environment, for instance? Because this is not part of the constitutional essentials, isn't it? Wouldn't these issues be broader, or would you say that there are other issues that we need to take into account when we think of the interests of transgenerational people rather than merely constitutional? And I also wonder, like from the very empirical, this is the last sentence, from the very empirical and this curiosity in terms of Serbia, who is the people in Serbia, I wonder. Now, we adopted the constitution in 2006. Did we break with the people from the past, or what is the beginning? How does that change? I wonder, and that's that.
Okay.
Wait. Marco?
Oh.
Okay, thanks to Mariam for organizing, and thanks Alessandro for actually writing a book. Without that, we wouldn't be here. So, as you mentioned in the beginning, this is a very complex book that tackles many questions. I take it, quite generally speaking, that the main overarching aim is to think about Rawls and his thoughts on constituent power, and to use that idea to answer the question, how can political decisions reached at time T1 be politically legitimate at another time at T2? In other words, one major goal is to develop a politically liberal account of transgenerational or intergenerational political legitimacy, understood as procedural conditions for democratic rule. Now, I'll lay out my cards on the table. I'm a great admirer of Rawls myself, and I do think that Political Liberalism, the book, offers us many super interesting ideas that do require some development. So it was a real pleasure to read your attempt to expand on some of the basic Rawlses or Rawlsian ideas that Rawls himself neglects. And that's the question of intergenerational political legitimacy. I think it's both a practically important issue because we tend to be myopic when it comes to future generations, especially the democratic process that currently have. But it's also philosophically interesting. You mentioned Rawls' seminal question of political liberalism. How is it possible that they may exist over time, a stable and just society of free and equal citizens who are profoundly divided by reasonable, sometimes incompatible, maybe even incommensurable, I would add, religious, philosophical, and moral doctrines. And it's worth, I think, remembering also that from A Theory of Justice and later, Rawls consistently mentions that he conceives of society as a system of cooperation from one generation to the next, but focuses only on issues between contemporaries. And many have focused, political philosophers have discussed justice between contemporaries, political legitimacy between contemporaries, completely ignoring this issue. So it was great to see that you took up this question, and I think it's also intuitively plausible to think that not yet existing, non-overlapping generations should have some voice, and this can be achieved right through creating some kind of new institutions. You mentioned several existing proposals in the book, or through the constitutional court. So that was kind of my take on what your project is, and I'll try to, for the sake or in the hope of instigating a discussion, play kind of a devil's advocate, because as I was reading the book, one question kept reoccurring to my mind, which seems to be kind of an underlying idea that you share with Rawls, and that is that not yet existing, non-overlapping generations ought to be taken into account. Their interests should be taken into account as a matter of political legitimacy. Now, I will completely neglect whether it's feasible to have some proxy representation. I'll ignore the epistemic problems of knowing what might the interests of future people be. I'll accept that. And ask the question whether democratic legitimacy is a plausible way to establish the claim that future generations ought to be politically represented. These comments will necessarily be brief and somewhat rudimentary, but hopefully that won't result in me doing injustice to a very complex analysis and arguments that you provide. So I'll start with saying a common understanding is that democratic legitimacy requires that anyone who's relevantly affected should be included in the democratic process. Provided that future generations are relatively affected by public decisions, legitimacy requires that we have some way of including future generations in the decision-making process. And so in a very simple way, we can formulate the following argument. The principle of democratic inclusion requires that the interests of future generations are represented by public institutions. The second premise would be principles of democratic inclusion are part of principles of democratic legitimacy. So the conclusion would be that the principles of democratic legitimacy require that the interests of future generations are represented by public institutions. And this seems to be a valid argument. The conclusion seems to follow from the premises. But what about the premises themselves? I won't say much about the first premise, that democratic inclusion requires that the interests of future generations are represented, but focus on the second premise. It seems intuitive that public institutions ought to be inclusive to be legitimate by democratic standards. This doesn't represent a complete account of democratic legitimacy, and democratic inclusion is not a sufficient condition. But the conclusion does depend on the assumption that a political representation of the interests of future generations are improvements in terms of democratic legitimacy. And it seems to me that we can distinguish between two versions of the claim that democratic legitimacy requires inclusion. One reading would be that democratic legitimacy unconditionally requires democratic inclusion, while a second reading would say that democratic legitimacy requires democratic inclusion only on the condition that some additional conditions apply. So to take a very everyday example, there is a difference between saying that a good dinner requires good wine and the claim that a good dinner requires a good wine, but a good wine contributes to the goodness of the dinner only if the food is good or decent. But both claims hold that good wine is necessary for a good dinner. The difference is that only the first claim holds that good wine unconditionally contributes to the goodness of the dinner. But on the second reading, a good wine contributes to make the dinner good only on the condition that the dinner is decent or good itself. So the point is that the second premise of the argument for the political representation of future generations can be read in two distinct ways. And it seems to me that this premise should be read as the claim that the representation of future generations enhances the democratic legitimacy of a political system only on the condition that some additional requirements are met. And the thought that I had while reading and thinking about this was whether these additional requirements for democratic legitimacy can be met with regards to future generations. Let me just see my note. So democratic inclusion would be necessary, but perhaps not a sufficient condition for democratic legitimacy. A democratic association is one where the people control the rules that both regulate and constitute a process of decision-making. The idea that the people should be empowered to decide not just the policies and rules that apply to them, but also the rules that apply to the institutional framework of decision-making. In state-like political units, the institutional framework is regulated by some higher law, the Constitution. So the democratic process is one where constitutional power is vested in the people. So this is kind of the scope issue, and you want to say that the people, and you assume that the people is different, doesn't simply include the electorate, the voters, the currently living, but also some not yet existing non-overlapping generations of people. But as I said, so the claim that democratic legitimacy requires democratic inclusion is either conditionally or unconditionally valid. It's conditionally valid if it's premised on some additional requirements, but the claim is unconditionally valid if it's not premised on additional requirements for democratic legitimacy. And it's possible, I think, to say that inclusion, democratic inclusion, contributes to the democratic legitimacy of a political association only if the members included share constitutional power. That is, they share constituent power. Even if an inclusive demos is not sufficient for democratic legitimacy, it seems plausible to think that an association with an inclusive demos is necessarily more legitimate than an association with a less inclusive demos. This is premised on an additive understanding of the criteria for democratic legitimacy. So if the criteria or additive more is always better. But the alternative might be to assume that the criteria for democratic legitimacy are, let's say, multiplicative. So, and if the criteria for democratic legitimacy are multiplicative, follows that an association that scores 0 on some criteria is without democratic legitimacy, even if it scores positively on some other criteria for democratic legitimacy. So if democratic inclusion and constituent power are additive, some institutions that would represent the interests of future generations make a positive contribution to the democratic legitimacy, even if future generations would lack a constituent power. But the conclusion would be different if the criteria are multiplicative. In that case, political institutions for future generations do make a positive contribution to democratic legitimacy only if they enable future generations to share in constitutional power. Let me just so future generations would share constituent power only if it is true either that they share in constituent power or that future generations are legally authorized to partake in the process of constitutional decision making. And the question that I would have is whether it makes sense to claim that future generations can be legally authorized, and if we answer that question in the negative, then it seems that the idea that democratic legitimacy requires taking the doesn't hold up to scrutiny. But I'll just finish by saying something to be clear. This kind of argument does not necessarily preclude the very idea that we do owe something to future generations and that their interests ought to be taken account. The very modest conclusion would only be that democratic legitimacy is not the way to argue for including future generations, but perhaps reasons of justice are the best way to argue for including future generations, and to develop a kind of intergenerational or transgenerational account of politically liberal justice. Yeah.
Thanks, Marco. Right. So, final questions. Alessandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you. What kind of timing are you thinking of for time? Half an hour. Okay. All right. Yeah, plenty of questions, more than I can chew here in answering. Let me go backwards, starting from Marco's. I'd love to then receive written comments at some point on that, because the argument was very complicated, and I'm not sure I grasped at some point the idea that democratic inclusion in the second version, in the B version, democratic inclusion of future generations could contribute to democratic legitimacy if some conditions were spelled out. The one example that adds to the value of the meal if the food is worth the wine, otherwise it doesn't. That's a good image. But I'm not sure I grasped, or if you mention any of these conditions that would allow for the democratic inclusion of future generations to contribute to legitimacy. I'm not sure what these conditions would be. I'm not sure you mentioned them, or just as a possibility.
So what I had in mind was that the additional condition would be that future generations are legally authorized in the decision-making process.
Okay. Yeah. I like I'm open to the general idea that there need to be some conditions, but not particularly enthused by this formulation here, because I think that the future generations become relevant when we're discussing amendments to the Constitution, not when we're discussing the legitimacy of exercises of authority, legislative authority, executive authority, judicial authority in the here now, in the regular process. At that level, I'm fine with the liberal principle of legitimacy, which Frank Michelman and I dedicated a book to it, saying, well, the great innovation, you go to classical liberalism, Locke, the distinguishing feature, the benchmark of the legitimacy of government is the consent of the governed. All right. And then Rousseau started mocking that view, saying, all right, what does the consent of the government mean? Some people want a neutral state. Other people want a militarily strong state. Some people want the state to be harsh on criminals. Some other people want it to be lenient on criminals. So what is the consent of the governed? And then the great breakthrough of Rawls is to say you can't expect, under conditions of pluralism in modern society, to have a unified consent of the government on single exercises. This law, this executive decree, this sentence. No way. It would be too strict a criterion. You can only hope for some convergence on the constitutional essentials. And then this law, this act of government, this sentence by the judges becomes legitimate. So I'm not oppressed when I'm forced to comply, if it is not inconsistent with that core of constitutional essentials on which supposedly there is the consent of the government. So that's the idea. Now, the future generations here don't necessarily come in at this level. They come in when you amend the Constitution, and there comes the question, which was raised by Elena too, of how do you know the interests of future generation? You don't. You don't know the orientations that they will develop. You can only what is normatively binding, I think, from an intuitive point of view, it is reasonable to say that it is normatively binding that you live them, using this Lockean expression, enough and as good autonomy as we have. So you don't bind them into constraints that diminish their political autonomy. That's their interest, and to keep it open in a way, to keep that autonomy open, and that whatever institution, whether a judicial institution or an ombudsman, ombudsperson, we should say, or some other institution represents the future generation. That's where they come in. And so I'm really looking forward then to some discussion of these conditions that specify when taking into account future generations offers a contribution to the discourse of legitimacy. And thanks for for linking these two things in a way, constituent power, the future generations, and the issue of legitimacy. Because to go back to the initial statement, I think that the great thing that's why we're discussing political liberalism is that you have two largely hegemonic views, either liberals who stay away from constituent power, from Kelsen to Habermas to Dworkin and so on, forget about it. And others who think that constituent power is a fact of political life, because as Schmidt magisterially says, laws don't enact themselves by themselves. They need someone who, endowed with a political will, creates the law or abolishes the law. Law is inert. And but then these people think that constituent power is unbound, basically cannot be. And the great thing of political liberalism is that you can say, yes, we have political constituent power, but it's not unbound, and what binds it is what is here up for discussion. And I like the final remark that you had on justice being perhaps a better ground, differently than legitimacy, for so it's in the name of justice rather than in the name of legitimacy. I fully share that that we want to bring in future generations. And legitimacy comes in only in matters of constitutional amendment. That's where considerations about future generations contribute to legitimacy, not in regular legislative or administrative or judicial activity. Okay. Now, let me go back to representation, and then I work my way to the first remark by Michal. Now, one point, you had a very articulate, rich set of comments. Let me start with the relation between chapter 5 on representation and then 6 on the interpretation of the Constitution. The link between the two is the fact that to represent people who live, who exist, as parliamentary representation means somehow to make their will effective in the world, right? With all the difference in understanding who is best positioned to understand what the representee wants and to what extent is bound and so on, with all that debate, but still, on the whole, is representing that will. But representing somebody who is not there is a different matter. And I wanted to pinpoint whether the term "to represent" means the same thing or two different things in these two cases, and it means somehow two different cases, two different things. In the point of constant flux of the Constitution, you can't step twice in the same Constitution, and how that relates to the finality, somehow to the conclusiveness of a judgment about what is consistent and what is not consistent with the political project enshrined in the Constitution. I don't see there a tension, because I associate the two statements with the point of view of the observer and the point of view of the participant. So, as observers of legal and political facts, we notice that constitutions change constantly. As Jelinek in a 1906 book, he had this title in German, Verfassungswandlung, which is this continuous, ongoing change, und Verfassungsänderung, and the constitutional change, intentional and in time. All right, and so we are observers when we claim that there is constitutional slippage over time. That's the meaning of you don't step in the Constitution twice. Bernard Williams had a great way of capturing that by saying, we can play 17th century music on 17th century instruments using 17th century techniques, but still we don't have 17th century music because we have 21st century ears. And that's the point of the you don't step twice in the same constitution. But that doesn't mean that as a participant, I don't have the constitution enlarged to the material constitution or the living constitution, not just the written text, that stands up against me somehow as an organic whole. And and so that I have as a mandate, as a court or as a private citizen, I can certainly exercise that type of judgment. I'm asked to say whether this proposal, say a law on protection and environment or something about LGBTQ legislation, anything is compatible or not with the Constitution, then that Constitution stands as an organic whole. The language, the example of language clarifies the point. Language is no less than constitutions are in constant flux. They change all the time. They borrow terms from one or another. They evolve new meanings. If you believe in the positional meaning of words, if a new term is added, then the whole structure of meanings somehow changes. But when we speak a language as participants, languages are organic wholes. Potrei dire queste stesse cose in italiano e la comprensione immediatamente sparisce. So we know that Italian and English are both in flux and they borrow from each other. Italian words end up in English. Many more English words end up in Italian. So what good does it do? As a participant, either I speak in English or parlo in Italiano. That's two things. So the two perspectives can be combined if you think of them as the standpoint of an observer and the standpoint of a participant who has to make a decision. So if we have a view of legitimacy as the one suggested by Rawls, namely forget about the consent of the governed on single items, but just think of legitimacy as the compatibility of a law, an act of government, a judicial act, with the Constitution on which supposedly there is an overlapping consensus. Okay, then we're bound to answer the question, is this compatible with the Constitution or not? And somebody has to give an authoritative answer on that, a pro tempore authoritative answer, as well as we are entitled to have our own judgment, of course. So we could say, yes, the court says it's constitutional. I think they got it wrong. So we have to have this space. So I'm bound by that law on which there is an authoritative judgment, because there has to be one for society to work. I'm bound to feel not oppressed because officially there is that judgment, but I doubt it. Personally, I doubt it, and I have freedom to express this doubt. So what is the standard there? The standard there is the most reasonable interpretation. So that means that the interpreter of the Constitution, on behalf of all of us, is entrusted with the task of saying whether this new law, for example, or this act of government is compatible with the commitments, with the political project that is expressed by the Constitution or it isn't. And it's the same position somehow on a collective level that Luther is placed in, when Luther famously said, "Here I stand, I can do no other. I can do no other." So, meaning by that, if I did something else, I would transform myself. I would no longer be the same person. So what we asked of an interpreter, of a judicial interpreter of the constitutionality of statutes, is to say whether the existence, the operativeness of these statutes leaves us with the same unchanged political project enshrined in the Constitution, or alters it, disrupts it, somehow alters it in ways that are unacceptable. And it's a weighing of factors in which there can be no final certainty. There's no, in Kantian parlance, is a reflective judgment on which there is no possibility of forcing someone by demonstration to agree, on penalty of being looked at as irrational. But it's not preference. Pitkin gets that when some point, when she says political issues, whether something is right, whether something is convenient, whether all of these political judgments are somewhere in between a geometrical demonstrations and matters of taste. They're not as open as matter of taste. There's some deeper ought in there, and yet at the same time they're not demonstrable. They're not the end of a chain of deductions. So a court is someone, as an interpreter of the political project enshrined in the Constitution, that is to pass that judgment. Because there is no certainty, then comes the part that you were questioning about how you relate to the pro tempore final public assessment that a court has given on whether a law, an act of government is compatible, is constitutional or not. We may agree or disagree, and disagree to a mild extent and then try another judgment, or strongly disagree and want to entrench the Constitution with an amendment that makes it say what we want it to say. And you're right in questioning the fact that silence may not be a sign of really consent. It might be a lack of opportunity to change the Constitution or something like that. That's a matter, I think that's, Bruce Ackerman has done egregious work on that, and showing that with reference to the context of the United States up to the New Deal, that was a normal way of challenging. There are a number of amendments that were, the 14th Amendment and other, were conceived as a way of rectifying wrong judgments by the Supreme Court. Fred Scott is one, and others. But after that, because of changing historical reasons and the relations among institutions like the presidency and Congress, and other historical, the acceleration of time and the long time it takes to ratify an amendment, that wasn't practical anymore. And so you don't have opposition in that way to change the Constitution. Last one was George W. Bush, who said, we will have the constitutions if, in response to current defenses of same-sex marriages, as we'll have a constitutional amendment that will make the Constitution say that marriage is the union of a man and a woman, and that failed. It didn't. It came to nothing, and it came over it fell. You had many more issues there that I can't do justice to. When does the people start is a very good question, because that is a common predicament of all of us latecomers, in a way, to democratic constitution making. Italy, as a democratic republic, starts in 1948, and as a state, it starts in 1861. So what happened in between? Well, you had a liberal state when non-democratic with a constitution which was given by a king, but of course a people, a demos. A people as a political subject lasts longer than a constitution, but we could stay faithful in a way to the old Aristotelian insight that politically, a demos, politically, a people is defined by its constitution. When the constitution changes, then you have a different demos, a different. The French have gotten that by enumerating their constitution: the third republic, the fourth republic, the fifth republic, all of which is concomitant with a major constitutional change. So when does a people start? It depends on what you mean by people. As a demos, as a subject of political action, as a self-regulating subject, if you're thinking of democracy, it is coeval with the democratic constitution. If you think of it as an ethnos, as an ethnic formation, as a cultural formation, then it exists. Even the Italian people, of which Chancellor Metternich ironically said Italy is a geographical expression at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. It had long pre-existed as a linguistic and cultural entity and came into being as a political unit in 1861. So a people, when does it start? It depends on what you mean. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It starts with the ratification, in a way, it starts with the ratification of a constitution. And one more comment, then one more comment on Pitkin. Rawls, Pitkin and Rawls. One of the interesting things of political liberalism, as far as the issue of representation is concerned, is the fact that Pitkin dislikes, in a way, descriptive representation, the idea of saying only somebody like me can represent me, because it's empirically untrue. Sometimes representatives who are not like you are much wiser and productive to your interest than those who are like you. And also because that perspective doesn't allow one to assess the act of representing. You can only say whether the person shares characteristics with the other. Okay, so she moves into the substantive representation where I want to evaluate how well the representer represents me. But when it comes to pluralism, to the condition of the warring gods, to use this Weberian terms, Pitkin gives up sort of in despair and says, well, under conditions of extreme value pluralism, I can only trust somebody who shares my same values. So I go back to descriptive representation. And that's not what Rawls would have, and the contribution that political liberalism brings to that debate is that even under condition of reasonable pluralism, I'm not reduced to just electing one of my tribe. I can use public reason, in a way, as an intermediate terrain on which to assess the quality of representation under condition of pluralism. Now, let me move finally, it's a long reply, to Michal. Very well taken 3 points. Dworkin and Rawls. Dworkin is somebody who also strongly subscribes to a transgenerational view of a people linked by legal integrity somehow, and the idea of the function of adjudicating the constitutionality of single exercise of power as making the most of the legal texture of the whole legal order, that shows how the chain novelist, the judge is a chain novelist, carries this transgenerational thrust. But the difference between making the most of the legal tradition and jurisprudential community, and on the other hand, the most reasonable judgment. The difference is best captured if we go back to Plato's image of the cave, the allegory of the cave, which I assume you're familiar with. You have this captive population of the cave forced to look at the shadows projected on the end of on the wall of the cave, and mistakes those for reality. Actually, they're all there is, so there's no distinction between appearance and reality. And then one of the fugitives, manages to ascend to the outside world, adjust to the light conditions out there, and begins to see things as they really are, the objects as the source of the shadows, and eventually lift up his gaze to the sun, whose light basically creates, makes the objects visible, and then the shadows, and comes back for reasons to be debated, goes back to the cave to inform his fellow captives there of the conditions, is met with diffidence and rejection, mostly because he can't adjust to the darkness of the cave back there, and eventually tries to inform them of how things really are out there in the world. Now, imagine that a group of fugitives leaves the cave, 4 or 5 of them, and then same thing comes back and wants to inform the people in the cave of what they've seen. Given the burdens of judgment, or the differential positioning or the limits of each finite subjectivity, they have an overlapping account of what they've seen, but also some differences. All right. Now, imagine that they would say, okay, let's have one person report to the people in the cave what we've seen, and they would basically agree then. I would say it's reasonable to think that they would agree on the fact that political power, coercive power, would be exerted in the cave from now on, assuming that they would end up ruling as philosopher kings the cave. Coercive power could be legitimately exercised only if backed up by the overlapping part of what they've seen outside. So that contingent positions of power wouldn't oppress people by enforcing laws that are backed up by controversial accounts of what's outside. Now, Dworkin and Rawls, the difference comes in when you reflectively think of what these 4 or 5 hypothetically fugitive philosophers are doing. Because Rawls would say the idea that the exercise of power should be limited to instances of power of authority that are backed up by overlapping parts of the account of what is outside is the best they can do given their differences as a self-produced way of conduct which responds to their perception of what is most reasonable for them to do. The Dworkinian view of making the most is the idea that one of them has the right answer. And we don't know who it is, so we're debating it. But in principle, there's one of them who has the right answer. So, making the most working and the most reasonable are ways of achieving sort of the same non-oppressive adjudication about the coherence of a single act of authority with the constitutional project, but one carries an epistemic cognitive ambition, carries a cognitive ambition that is not there in the Rawlsian one. Okay, the background culture is to be supported. I think there's a whole long standing debate about the importance of the democratic ethos to the functioning of democratic institutions, the democratic ethos being reinforced through education, but not only that, through a functional public sphere. And I think Rawls has contributed to that by adding his own virtues, a list of virtues in chapter 5 to what this democratic ethos is, which has been basically identified by Montesquieu and Rousseau with virtue as the priority of the common good over factional good, by Tocqueville on equality, and he has brought. Then there is the transcendentalists, who bring up individuality as part, the search for individuality and individuation as part of the democratic ethos, and Rawls has brought in other. Reasonableness, basically, and and a number of other virtues there. So there is that importance of those things. And finally, the third point is this addition in the new introduction to the paperback edition of the extension of pluralism to liberal conceptions of justice. That is, Frank Michelman has published, subsequent to that book, has published a book of his own, Constitutional Essentials, where he reconstructs Rawls's project for constitutionalism, and he deals with that innovation. In the discussion of that book, we have a dialogue on that point. He thinks somehow that bringing in a plurality of conceptions of justice can be an enrichment of the model. And certainly it is a response to agonistic critics of Rawls. I think it brings in problematic aspects. Problematic aspects, you asked, how can they be incompatible? Well, they can be incompatible because liberal theories of justice, not conceptions of the good, but liberal theories of justice could be, for example, oriented toward a deontological set of intuitions. So for me, as a Rawlsian, it doesn't really matter if in a community there is a prevailing of a Habermasian view of justice as discursive generalization or a Durkheimian view as making the most. It doesn't matter. I can live with that if most people stand by that different view of justice. But then there is the line across with consequentialist views of justice, utilitarianism. There, I think it's much more intractable, the difference. They may be incompatible. Think of the pandemic, COVID, right? So the idea of pursuing herd immunity by letting people get infected with COVID, that came up in political context shaped by the strong influence of utilitarianism, right? So that could be a political version of utilitarianism, not a metaphysical one. There could be one, I assume. But incompatible, I think that a deontologically minded citizen could have some trouble not feeling oppressed by policies of government that are deemed constitutional by the interpreter of the constitutional, all of this against the background of a consequentialist view of justice. So I think there could be trouble there. And my answer to how you deal with that in the model is tapping some resources, which is in the chapter on constitutional consensus and overlapping consensus and under-theorized difference. So one could say, perhaps, that an overlapping consensus is a very ambitious ideal to be achieved when the citizens of a country sort of converge on believing that a certain political view of justice is the most reasonable for them. But when that doesn't happen, so when you have a group of citizens not only have different views of the good, but some of them embracing a view of justice, say, along deontological lines, and others along consequentialist lines, then maybe overlapping consensus is too ambitious a goal, and we have to settle for something less, which is constitutional consensus. Not modus vivendi, which is just converging on judgments of expedience in fear of the consequences of not agreeing, not modus vivendi, but still not overlapping consensus, something in which we just converge on very broad procedural elements, rule of law, separation of powers, elections, stuff like that, but not on the basic rights, but not on the applications of this. So this could be a way of accommodating this new step by Rawls of allowing pluralism among conceptions of justice, which is testimony in a way to the intellectual courage of the enterprise of political liberalism, which started as a response to communitarian theorists and feminist theorists, and continues that attitude of self-questioning in a way. But thanks for all the very complex. I'm not sure. It's not that I'm not sure I've given answer. I'm sure I've not given answers. But you'll forgive me for that.
I think you have given answers, and of course, I mean. Yeah, that there has been a real variety of questions, and I think we all have a much clearer understanding of some points now, some key points in the book. Well, let's have a short break. I mean, it's 1:10. Let's have a 10-minute break. So here we are back for the second session, composed of two sets of commentators. We've heard some very in-depth discussion of the political theoretic arguments of the book, and now we have slightly more kind of differentiated contributors coming from various backgrounds. We have the group of our first three commentators in the second round here. We have Vujo Ilić from the Institute, we have George Christov from the Institute, and we have Srđan Prodanović from the Institute. So let's first hear Vujo.
Thank you, Marian. Should we speak to the microphone?
Yes.
This any good? Huh?
Yeah.
So it's been great that we have the opportunity to deal with a certain issue for more than a couple of hours or so. So thank you for being here with us, and thanks, Marian, for the invitation. The time is really quickening, and we don't have much opportunities to discuss the issue at length. So it's been told already in the previous panel that this work is basically advancing or refining or extending some arguments inside a paradigm that was established to take liberal outside or out of defensive posture, and I think it really reflects what I thought about this book well. It all hinges about this notion over time. What does it mean over time? This temporal dimension seemed to me so central to it, and that's what I'm also going to talk about or ask about. The whole idea of transgenerational people, it's kind of intriguing, and I want to talk more about this. The idea that we are a living segment apart rather than a whole of the people, and that we are bounded by the previous and the coming segments. And that somehow, this could be easy to say, but then once we have to set up the institutions that would do this transgenerational regulation, such as constitutional courts or Supreme Courts, then the real problems start. And I think you don't talk explicitly, I think, about it, but other authors do about presentism, as a counter tendency. There is or sort of a denial of this transgenerational perspective, and in a way, in this presentism are the two main challenges that I want to talk about. One is certainly what you talk about, a populist presentist tendency, and the other one is a climate crisis. So I would like to talk about backward and forward from the present views of this transgenerational regulations. So my interventions are mostly context-sensitive questions. They're not really related to theory. So when it comes to the populist challenge, of course, I mean, we all know well that the populist challenge, and you say it really well, that it equates electorate with the people. It gives the full constituent and sovereign power to the electorate, and it basically introduces this serial constitutional framework. So each people have the full power to set up their constitutions, and we know from practice that when populist leaders come to power, they come with the promise of being in conflict with these entrenched powers, the entrenched structures. This is the promise that they made to the electorate. And in practice, we see that the first thing that most of the populists do is that they attack the constitutional courts. It's been done in Poland, in Hungary, in Turkey, in Egypt, around the world. Basically, we see it really as a constant scenario. And what the populists do is that they try to widen the gap between those who exercised the constituent power and those who are constituted. So these two concepts that we talk about, so the constituted and the constituent, they want to widen it, basically. They want to show that there is a wide difference between these two authors of the Constitution. And my main question is okay, so what do we do if there is no gap, basically? And I want to go to the empirical part, to where we should see this. So in Serbia, since 1869, there has been 11 constitutions. In average, there's 14 years between two constitutions. So the shortest one lasted for 2 years, the longest one lasted for only 19 years, I think. And actually, even though we think our current constitution is like, it just happened yesterday, it was in 2006, actually in a year or two, this will be a longest lasting constitution we ever had. And so basically, every generation has exercised constituent power. It's quite different even from Italy that you mentioned. Like there was a 1948 constitution, 1848 constitution. Even if we think about, expected lifetime of around 40 years in 19th century Italy, there were generations that did not exercise constituent power. And so if every generation brings new legal order into existence, I was wondering how would our expectations of amending powers be seen in this certain environment? So the experience of being subjected to constituent power is simply lacking. Each and every generation has a quite realist expectation that every living segment did and will have full constituent powers. And so my question is really whether, this populist challenge that you're talking about has different weights in different environments that I try to describe, and which we could call, political culture or not. So how does this challenge work in different environments? The other thing that I wanted to talk about is the presentism and the climate change, basically, or the climate crisis. I like the discussion about the sequential and serial sovereignty. I think it makes a lot of sense. that the serial sovereignty is basically sovereignty exclusively owned by the living segments, and that one of the bad sides of serial sovereignty is that it cannot prevent the living segment from intentionally curtailing the rights and freedoms of the future generations. And so I was thinking about, environmental rights that are basically enshrined in around 100 constitutions globally. And I'm talking about rights for humans. So I'm not discussing, the minority of constitutions that probably extends rights to nature. I think there still may be, a couple of them, but they're certainly not the majority. So these are not constitutional essentials, but these are some constitutional rights. And what we know about the environmental crisis is that in the very near future, and certainly for the future generations, these rights will be diminished. There will be diminished expression of these rights in the future. And so the reason or the difficulty of dealing with this problem is that the benefits of the living segment will always overshadow these costs of the future segments of the population, which makes dealing with this very difficult for the living segment. And my question is like, how should the transgenerational regulation deal with this? So if the current, the living segment wanted to prevent this, that means that the future generation should be fairly represented, and that means that basically we need to have a good quality of interpreting their rights in the future. In the process of interpreting, you explain this, basically the soundness rests on the most reasonable concept, and that somehow these judges should come to the point that they cannot but make a certain decision, which I find difficult or impossible when it comes to climate crisis, because of the two reasons. One reason is that the issue at stake, it's huge, and it would involve drastic changes in our not only the way we live, but also I would assume in the constitutional order and this standard of soundness. I mean, we are always talking about the probabilities here. It's we may set this probability at a different percentage. It's 90% or 80 or 95 or 90, but we're always talking about the probability. And I find it, the difference between just reasonable and most reasonable here, it's quite important. I would say that we all think it's most reasonable that constitutions should be changed in order to guarantee these future rights for the next segments. But coming to the point where we will have a consensus that it's most reasonable, it's probably going to be too late for anything to change in the future. So I wouldn't say it's intentional curtailing of the rights of the future generations, but actually not amending is intentional, and not amending constitutions to adapt to these expectations becomes regressive. So not acting is regressive in a way when we look at the context of climate crisis, because the future generations will find it less than reasonable to live within the constitutional framework and also like political framework that they will inherit from the living generation. So I hope this kind of makes sense, the problem that I see, and I'm mostly wondering like how could we go around this problem? Are these standards basically preventing us from making any sort of sound political constitutional changes that could somehow address this issue? And basically both of my comments / questions are dealing with the problem of hyper-presentism. So with the populist challenge, with the challenge of climate crisis, I wonder whether this paradigm can only basically stand in well-established liberal constitutional democracies, or once it deals with questions like this, or once it is being applied in a different political cultures, it kind of fails to live to its promise basically. So I hope I was brief enough, and I'm looking forward to discussion.
Thanks a lot, Vujo. Now let us hear George, if everything is working.
Yes, only can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
But the camera is for some reason off. I enabled it.
I know that my camera is not working on my laptop, but I don't think you are dependent on my laptop now, right?
I'm not sure. Yeah, when I start the video, it's just black. Although
Yeah,
it
maybe
shows
you're
that my
still
camera
dependent
is
on my-
working.
Never mind, George.
Yeah.
Just.
Okay. Well, should we just continue like this? Yeah, okay. Yeah, first, apologies for being now just this disembodied voice here. I was really looking forward to participating, but I managed to injure myself. So I'm immobile for the moment. Thank you first for this book. And I really enjoyed reading it, and I learned a lot from it, in particular about Rawls, an author that, well, due to my biases, always remained in the background for me. And although there was a lot of new things that I learned from the book, a lot of the themes of your book, in my opinion, at least, go back to beginnings of political philosophy, and not just the obvious and interesting application of Plato's allegory of the cave, but actually the central question of the book, the nature of political power across generations. And Plato famously presents the changes between political regimes as a transfer of power from one generation to the other. And something similar we find in Polybius, where this cyclical passage between the regimes is seen as a transfer of power between fathers on the one hand and grandchildren on the other. And as always, for the ancient authors, things always start good, but then everything falls apart. And the reason for this, in their eyes at least, is that the fathers, the founders, they know why they have to organize political power in a certain way. And it's always in relation to what came before. So, for example, in Polybius, the king is at the beginning good, but his offspring become tyrants, and then aristocrats have had enough of tyrants, so they overthrow them. Then the grandchildren of the aristocrats become oligarchs, so the democrats have to overthrow them, only for their grandchildren to ruin everything. And the reason why this happens is that the generations that follow, in particular the grandchildren, they forget why the founders had to establish a given regime. So the founders experienced oppression, and they remember this well. The grandchildren forget. They take the regime they are living under for granted. For example, the grandchildren of the Democrats take freedom and equality for granted. They don't value them anymore. They don't care to believe in these principles. Now, of course, even for the ancients, there were institutional arrangements that could decelerate regime collapse, such as the famous mixture of the constitutions, but the people couldn't just rely on institutional arrangements. They also had to trust each other, meaning they had to be prepared to cooperate. And for Machiavelli, for example, who inherited this line of thinking, the best way to achieve this, to decelerate decline, is to make the people regularly, from time to time, experience those same passions that the founders were confronted with. So fear of oppression, loss of freedom, independence, and so on. And this will then prevent them from forgetting why such and such a constitution had to be founded in the first place. Now, I point to these examples because this was primarily the lens through which I've read your book. And following Rawls, you also make a sharp distinction between this idea of a mere balance of power arrangement and an arrangement where political actors, as you say, don't simply understand each other's positions, but to a certain degree endorse and share these positions. As Rawls himself points out, the Weimar Republic fell because the traditional German elites did not believe in the constitution anymore. And as a result, they were not willing to cooperate to make it work. And when this shared belief is gone, the regime then soon follows. So basically, I read your book as a kind of a denunciation of cynicism against the degradation of political belief, shared political belief. We can't remain indifferent to political principles which animate a given regime. As you write, after the Second World War, the German and the Italian constitutions emerged, and I quote you, primarily as a safeguard against the return of the past. And we could, of course, take comparable examples and say the founders of the European Union knew why they needed such a union, and later generations tend to forget, as we can see in the past several years. Now, of course, these old authors, ancient authors, things always, as said, go historically bad. The laws make human beings good, and when the laws are not believed in anymore, then the citizens turn bad. So they always needed this moment of refoundation in this circle. And this is, of course, from our perspective, a rather pessimistic anthropology. Yours is much more directed at hope. On the one hand, you argue, and I quote, that Rawls' overlapping consensus on a political conception of justice is meant as an ideal theory end state to be striven for or used as a yardstick. At the same time, you do have real-world references from which you draw most of your examples, the Constitution of the United States. In other words, your theory, as I understand, is not meant as an ex nihilo creation or the zero-hour transition from the state of nature into history, but presupposes, as you point out, already existing forms of reconciliation. So we don't start with the Hobbesian war. We start from some historical instance of an established reconciliation among different doctrines. And the issue then is how to preserve and strengthen this piece, prevent falling back into some kind of oppression. And in my opinion, the anthropology behind your politics is of history shows us kind. So history provides us with what we can think of as being realistic. And our task is, in a kind of a Hegelian fashion, to extract the ideal and make it into the normative end state of the real. So, for example, history shows us that people are or can be reasonable, in other words, willing to cooperate under fair terms, meaning that the reasonable is already in some way at work in history. So again, the question of this historical remembering, not forgetting who we historically are, is important. Now, of course, the centuries divide authors such as Polybius, Machiavelli, Rawls, not to mention their respective historical context, theoretical concerns, and also the views of what we could call human nature, at least in the context of this history shows us argument. But I would also argue that they agree on one thing, and that is history shows us that people, even in bitter disagreement, can cooperate. Only there's older authors, ancient authors, would say true, yes, but under certain conditions. As Polybius says, even the mutual aggression between the different orders of citizens of the Roman Republic could be tamed and the citizens brought into zealous cooperation. But the condition is that this unity must come from the outside in the shape of a fear of a common enemy. So what Rawls called meritus hostilis. And you address this point, I believe, in chapter 3, where you, in my opinion, convincingly argue against the confusion of Schmitt's the political and Rawls' political liberalism. In other words, between, on the one hand, friend-enemy distinction, and on the other, the reasonable-unreasonable distinction. Now, I'm not so much concerned here with the reasonable-unreasonable distinction within the polity itself or between even contemporaries, as much as with this idea of a historical instance of the unreasonable, which serves as the justification point for the necessity of coming to a reasonable consensus. In other words, in Polybius language, now the memory of the aristocrats of what it was like to live under a tyrant, or the memory of the democrats of what it was like to be ruled by oligarchs, or this constitutive memory for contemporary Italian and German constitution, or also, of course, for US Constitution. So does the invocation of these examples then, in a sense, prove the point that the ancients were trying to get across? Yes, people will cooperate, but under certain historical conditions. So despite the differences in moral disagreements, they should carry some common scars from the past on the basis of which a consensus will be possible. Now, as said, this would not necessarily be a contemporaneous enemy within the polity or outside of it, but one at a historical distance. At the same time, one that will not be too distant. So the sack of Rome by the Gauls that Machiavelli cites worked for the Romans, but it doesn't do much for us. Just as the Second World War, the Holocaust, or 9/11 will be of no effective significance for future generations. And this then means to create some space for common belief, that people maybe need a common memory, and which means that the reasonable cannot sustain itself without this historical background of the unreasonable. So in order to be sustainable throughout generations, does it then follow that some generations will have to be exposed or even sacrificed to this unreasonable in order to prevent the regime from becoming devoid of belief, of common belief, and revert back to a kind of a near balance of power arrangement or even completely collapse? So in short, my question boils down to this famous saying of Thomas Jefferson: does the tree of liberty, or in this case, a common belief concerning constitutional essentials, has to be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants? Thank you.
Thank you, George. And third discussant in this round is Srđan Prodanović. Srđan, please.
Thank you, Marian, and thank you, Professor Ferrara, for being with us once again. And I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to talk about your book. Firstly, let me stress that I utterly share your commitment to this radical idea of political realism, which remains pluralistic even in the ideal world. So it's not something which is a fall for grace, something to be handled theoretically or practically. And it is an important, I think, implication. And moreover, I think that every kind of truly progressive social theory needs to conceptualize this kind of radical pluralism, while also, because it's not defensive, so providing something with that Rorty called social hope. Essentially social hope, which is a openness towards social change, which is not foundationalist, not essentialist. So in here, I think there is a tension to be addressed between the social change and the continuity and the openness towards social change. So what I mean is in chapter 4, you answered the so-called on the distinction between ethnos and the demos. And I think that this tension can be found in both of these terms. What I mean is that in some sense, both of the terms can hinder incorporation of some groups within the pluralistic universe of liberalism, as is envisioned in your reading of Rawls. The main problem is that both the demos and the ethnos have a conventional view of identity. It's articulated, it's more or less, defined in a cognitive manner, let's say. Not always, but it has a strong cognitive component. And now we see that many social movements, many proto-movements, let's say, especially those that try to tackle systemic injustices which are embedded within something which is called complex domination, etc., they try to avoid this rigid identity. They refuse to identify themselves. They even refuse to be called political, especially in Serbia. So my question is, how do we incorporate them? How do we give them a place at the table, a place within the overlapping consensus? So that's the first question. What are your thoughts? Especially if the distinction between ethnos and the demos is constitutive in order to avoid what's Rousseau's riddle. So the second question also in some sense is connected to this first one. It pertains to time. Time was articulated in the first panel also as a problem. So what constitutes a continuity of a social system? So now I'm, having my sociologist hat on. So I asked this question particularly in regards to what you called, and you also in the introduction said this, wanton republic. Right. I don't think that we need to worry about that scenario that much. I mean, especially we have in mind that power structure, discourses, narratives that are not hard-coded into any constitution are important, and sometimes even more important for the reproduction of the social system. And if this is true, then even, let's say, some kind of reflection which is premised on second order desires about what I mean. You get it. So if you reflect about customs, you can essentially avoid this trap of wanton republic. So I would like to hear what are your thoughts on this issue, and also if we continue this theme of time. And this is something also that you can perhaps skip the question, because I think that you answered it in some sense, which is how do we tackle the question of future generations, especially if we have in mind that one aspect of justice, a crucial one, perhaps one would say, is articulation of needs. So in essence, if you cannot, you can really, it's really difficult to predict the needs of future generations. And to return to my first question, this is precisely why it is difficult to articulate an identity when you're trying to tackle the most systemic violence or most systemic forces of dominance. The silence of these movements actually echoes the future generation. This is why the whole strategy of performative power of assembly that Butler talks about hinders on this idea not to articulate. So to remain silent, to introduce a complexity within the reproduction, within the customs, etc. So how does this optics figure in with your accounts? So I will stop there because we are stressed for time. So thank you once again.
Thanks, Srdjan. So, Alessandro, once again, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, well, also this batch of questions were very, very challenging and bring me to the limit somehow of what I've been writing on by pulling my attention to different parts. Now let me start with the meaning of over time and the way of representing future generation. Yeah, if every generation changed the Constitution, there would be no amending. There would be just a new one. Only the first rate, the complete constituent power, and the Jeffersonian idea at the end of this letter, because he articulates this view in a letter to Madison dated September 6th, 1789, where he defines the transgenerational constitution as an act of force, not of law. And in that picture, he says generations of a people should relate to one another as foreign nations, not to meddle in each other's affairs, leaving each other alone. So if that was the case, then you would, in this serial picture, then you would have self-enclosed cultures, self-enclosed political, constitutional cultures, identity, and no amending. Each time you would have a new exercise of constituent power. And a second point, this was the different constitutional cultures, and the bad aspects of this. this serial model of sovereignty, the bad aspect is the fact that it leaves us nothing to rely on to build a needed idea of what distinguishes an Italian, a Serbian, a French, a German, an American. Would leave us no material, no stuff to rely on other than ethnic traits, with all the dangers associated with them. Whereas in the idea of political liberalism for Rawls, a constitution is the political project of certain people to govern itself in a certain way. So it's a project that could be shared. It doesn't have any ethnic connotation, but that it requires this transgenerational continuity. It is interesting, the point of environmental rights somehow, or stuff that has to do with also protection of non-human rights, but the idea of environmental protection, which has been encoded in Constitution in so many recent constitutional amendments, interesting is the fact that the constitutional core, the essentials, need not be always the same. It could be enriched. So we're not limited to footnotes. We, the living members of a people, we're not limited to footnotes. We can intervene on the text somehow. And I think we could defend that by saying that an enriching version of it, so adding dimensions of freedom, as opposed to withdrawing dimensions of freedom to future generations, is an enrichment of the core. Now comes the question, if you want to protect the environment, you have to reduce the rights, say, of enterprise, of economic freedom. So you cannot, you're less free than before in running certain type of business, polluting businesses, which up to now were totally free. Or take the issue of balanced budgets. Previous generations were free to splurge on states' resources to the expense of the future ones. Now that freedom is limited. Okay, but there I would sort of address the conundrum of diminishing the freedom of future generations in certain areas in order to preserve or enhance the freedom in others, as a way of balancing these different rights. I would conceptualize the reduction of certain freedom, the freedom to start polluting business or the freedom to run up a big public debt, as collateral, unfortunate requirements of pursuing a larger freedom. So they're not intentional in a way. We don't know how to spend all the money on retirements and public services and yet not raise taxes to a point of intolerability. If a genius of economy comes in and tells us how, we're happy to listen to that. But so it's something unwanted, which is different from a normative point of view from in constitutional amendment which is designed to reduce the freedom of future generations. As for instance, if you have a legal system where you have same-sex marriage introduced, either by legislation or by judicial sentences, and then 2 generations afterwards you abolish that, and you go back to saying marriage is a man and a woman. That is intentional and is different. So the core of the Constitution could be significantly changed. One could argue that in the case of the American Constitution, the 14th Amendment, the 3 amendments in the wake of the Civil War were meant to modify the core. So I would address that diminishing aspect as balancing. And again, I apologize for not being complete in my answer, but we can then talk later about that. On the questions of yeah, it's very interesting remark, George. Can you hear me? I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Those were really interesting remarks on say the anthropology in that is presupposed by this model somehow, and the relation with history. I think there is a deep sense in the Rawlsian project, in political liberalism, a deep sense of history and contingency. If I were, political liberalism is a cryptic title because it requires you to understand what it meant by political, because in a sense, it's obvious that liberalism is not an aesthetic theory, it's not a scientific theory, it's political, but yet the meaning of political in Rawlsian parlance is so specific, you need to decode that. If you wanted to do a more easily accessible title, I would suggest the contingency of justice. So the contingency of justice, because you don't want a Hegelian picture where all that is real is reasonable and all that is reasonable is real. You don't want that. A footnote to Hegel in that sense. You want a real sense of the contingency of history, and in a way also the resistance, not unlimited plasticity of human nature built into that, but mostly a sense of the fact that normative theorizing about justice cannot bypass the facts of history. There's one statement here that is in the chapter on public reason that I like to quote, that gives you this sense of how Rawls is different from other normative theorists, where he says, admittedly, in the long run, a strong majority of the electorate can eventually make the Constitution conform to its political will. This is simply a fact about political power as such. There's no way around this fact, not even by entrenchment clauses that try to fix permanently the basic democratic guarantees. So you may have a normative theory of what is implicitly unamendable in the constitutional core and say that an amendment that reestablishes religion in a secular state is in a secularized or religiously neutral state is illegitimate, but in the long run that means nothing. In the long run, there's no way you can rein in history if it's so. So that's one of the messages. Without that lapsing into a political realist view of the process. So historical manifestations of the unreasonable are most often this starting points, and shared memories of that are the basis for this constitutional construction. One response that I have to that point is that these need not be necessarily catastrophic, as the case of Italy and Germany testify to. There could be more positive experiences of collective breaks or interruptions of continuity that play a foundational role. Think of the fall of the Berlin Wall, think of the reunification of Germany, or examples of liberation from colonial rule which is not domestic disaster like Italy and Germany, but is something like freeing yourself from something external. So we debate the construction of a political and legal order on which you can have overlapping consensus depends on this shared historical experiences somehow finds there its grounding, its first stone, its basic ground, but that need not be a catastrophic one. And that the tree of liberty needs to be refreshed for sure. The tree of liberty, so the memory of this is not self-perpetuating by itself. It can fade away. It can fade away. So there we intercept again this interface between law on the one hand and culture, the point of democratic culture, democratic ethos that was raised earlier. There's a continuity between the legal and the institutional and the cultural, and that is not automatic. And I come to the remarks by Serge, and you pointed to something that is worth emphasizing at the beginning, the radical idea of pluralism that we found in Rawls. And a term of contrast there is, for instance, Habermas, two great champions of liberal democratic thinking, both of them steeped in Kantian, trying in their own way to reconstruct Kant and to adapt Kantian practical doctrine to the contemporary context. But look at the deep difference when it comes to pluralism. For Habermas, intractable pluralism is the outcome of what in theological terms we could call the depravity of the world. The fact that the ideal presuppositions of communication are never met in practice. That's why we have pluralism. If we were an ideal world where the ideal presuppositions of communication were satisfied, then the better argument would win the case in all circumstances, and we won't need that kind of pluralism. We would spontaneously converge on the best argument. And so if we have pluralism, it is because the world we live in is imperfect and those presuppositions are not satisfied. Not so for Rawls. Even due to the burdens of judgment, even in a well-ordered society, we would have deep pluralism, reasonable pluralism. That is worth emphasizing. And the second point is about ethnos and demos and the nature of identity. And yeah, I understand that there is a resistance. In a way, deconstructionist, post-structuralist philosophical reflection mirrors something that happens in reality. That is a more fluid understanding of identity that doesn't tie it up to a center. The center kind of thing. How do we bring these subjects to the table, and how you deal with that? Yeah, I find the idea of a centerless identity problematic, and equally problematic its philosophical projection. Now that you have to work with the actors you have. You can't expect, you can't wish your actors to become what you want them to be. And then how do you bring them to the table? One tool from the box that could be helpful is the idea of discursive representation by Dreisig, a reincarnation of virtual representation by Burke, perhaps. But I don't know, but still, it's something. So you might want to represent their point of view, their needs, their preferences in the public sphere, Habermasian terms or in the public debate, by having some mechanism of representation that doesn't rely on self-attributed or even worse, otherly attributed center of identity. And the wanton, eventually, and in the end, the wanton republic, can its effect be avoided? Was that the question in the end? Yeah, I think, then again, it's the interface between the legal bindings of a certain constitutional court, and if it doesn't have a reflection in the political culture, then it won't prevent slippage. It won't prevent this it won't be able to establish continuity over time. It will change, and the remedy to that cannot be legalistic in a way. It is something deeper seated that has to do with continuity of culture, with education, with the intrinsic, with the fact that our institutional construct do reflect something that is deeper down there, and that is the way. That is the only way in which a wanton republic, a republic that changes at every generation, can be avoided. That's what I would say. But thanks again for its challenging remarks.
Thank you, Ron. Thanks a lot, Alessandro.
Thank you.
Yes, we have Milan here now. So we are now in our final round of interventions, and there are two of us remaining. That's Milan and myself. And let me begin. Then I'll give the word to Milan. So both of our interventions deal with your critique of populism, or at least take their cue from there and then expand upon them, as it's a topic, of course, of the greatest interests for sociologists and critical theorists. So your critique of populism states the following characteristics as fundamental for the populist outlook. The already mentioned serial conception of sovereignty, which means the equation of the people with the electorate, with the living segment, full constituent power for the electorate, and presumptively justified intolerance toward all those political opinions that differ from the one correct interpretation of the people's will. Now, you go on to argue that there are no significant differences between left and right populism with respect to these three characteristics, except perhaps that the presumptively justified intolerance moment might be weaker in the left variety. Now, I will have a question regarding left populism, but let me begin with your characterization of right-wing populism. And I have one diagnostic remark in this respect, if I may call it that way. Now, it struck me that when it comes to what sociologists call discursive strategies in political struggle, right-wing populism relies on attributing these very characteristics that you use to define right-wing populism in the book. So they attribute these very characteristics to liberal, and especially what might be termed left liberal political actors of today. The many contextual differences between various right-wing populist movements notwithstanding, one of their key common denominators, I would argue, is the discursive construction of the liberal elites, so the antagonistic pole that is constitutive of their own identity, the discursive construction of the liberal elites as epistocratic political actors who, once in power, aim to redesign social reality in accordance with their worldview. Convinced that they possess a superior moral outlook, liberal elites are, according to this critique, the carrier of a moralizing abstract normativity of principles that operates in a speculative mode detached from the socio-cultural background, the life world of the social reality. And although this normativity might exhibit a high degree of rationality and internal consistency, which enables the elites to take a condescending attitude toward the people, it ultimately does not resonate with who we are in terms of our historical development. That's what right-wing populists would say. Therefore, when liberal elites in power engage in projects such as legalization of same-sex marriage or introduction of gender-neutral language, they are exercising serial sovereignty because they are violating the background. Furthermore, the populists would argue when left liberal actors engage in political or intellectual mobilizations such as the tearing down of Confederate statues in the United States or critical revisiting of the legacies of slavery and colonialism across the Western world, they are practicing normative presentism. That's a term that Vujo already discussed. And it's peculiar because it's a kind of resignification of the standard meaning of presentism in social sciences. For right-wing populism, presentism means retroactive reading of our present-day liberal norms into earlier historical epochs in a way that is abstract and alienated, and that does not do justice to the constraints of the normative horizons of those previous times. And we've all heard this critique. It's usually summed up under the formulation, the totalitarian threat of social engineering. It is shared by the more conventional conservative critics of liberalism and right-wing populists. But what is specific of right-wing populism is that it presents itself as a kind of a remedy for this. So what they say is authoritarian measures are necessary to restore what they understand as sequential sovereignty of the people in the sense of a reactionary congruence of the present and the past. So when either classical conservatives, like for example the dissenting justices of the Supreme Court of the United States in Obergefell versus Hodges with respect to same-sex marriage, or right-wing populists like Trump and Javier Milei with respect to abortion, when all of them say, let's give this issue back to the people to decide, I would say there is more to it than simply saying, let's give this to the electorate to decide through a majority vote. There is also a kind of transgenerational claim in the sense that the majority of the electorate, in their opinion, are in some sort of resonance with past generation, perhaps even with future ones, and with who we are in the sense that you define this in the book. Now, this kind of maneuver is what gives right-wing populism some of its mobilizing power, I would say. The idea that it is fighting against some kind of epistocracy that uses the force of rational argumentation, the force of the better argument, to violate a background, a cultural societal background that, as you say, cannot be formulated in terms of propositional content. And this is why they would argue, the populist ideologues, when people feel angry, when they feel resentment, it's not because of socioeconomic frustration, it's because they feel they are right about their, rejection of liberal progressive policies, but they can't really articulate what's bothering them because it can't be formulated in terms of propositional content. That's how they would justify this anger that they are riding on. Now, my question is, do we have to formulate, and if yes, how, an effective response to this discursive strategy which turns the liberal critique of populism on its head, turns it against liberalism? How do we persuasively argue to a broader audience that progressive normative change is not exercise of serial sovereignty? Your book offers plenty of resources. For example, the concept of political originalism, a proposal as to what constitutes a legitimate amendment of a democratic constitution that does not violate the background and satisfies the condition of vertical reciprocity between generations. And you give the contrasting examples of same-sex marriage versus polygamy, where you argue that the first can be defended on these grounds of vertical reciprocity, whereas the second cannot, at least not under present conditions. You also make many references to exemplary normativity as opposed to the abstract abstract normativity of principles. So could you elaborate a bit on how exactly exemplary normativity can escape the populist charge of presentism in the context that I've been describing? And well, when speaking about bringing the Constitution more in line with its original promise, could we try and perhaps concretize this a bit further? So what I have in mind, for example, is your mentioning of Christina Lafont's perspective. She argues that a good decision of a constitutional court is one which invites the citizens to put on their robes and debate a certain issue vigorously but open-mindedly in the public, instead of entrenching themselves into rigid warring positions. Could we then argue, for example, along the lines of Axel Honneth's notion of normative surplus, that to bring a constitution more in line with its original promise means to make such proposals at modification that do not result in simple unreflective affirmation of the background that we are comfortable with, but that challenge us in a way that they issue a certain call to engagement to all of us, to engage in this vigorous debate, because we have been provoked by some kind of innovative reading of this normative legacy, because this is exactly what the formulation, our aspirations. So when you say in resonance with who we are and with our aspirations are to be fully participating citizens of a democratic polity. So when a decision to amend the Constitution invites us to become engaged in a very intense sense, then this is in line with our aspirations. Finally, with respect to left populism, you criticize Nancy Fraser as one representative of left populism because she holds a conception of serial sovereignty in your argumentation, due to her insistence on the necessity of fundamental socioeconomic change, which means an amendment of what you seem to consider an entrenched constitutional essential, which is the market economy, and because of her insistence on what she calls building the counter-hegemonic bloc to what she calls progressive neoliberalism, and which you interpret as a kind of antagonistic political outlook. At the same time, you argue elsewhere in the book that if we are constrained by the basic normative structure of the Constitution, we should not at the same time be constrained by the cognitive horizon of the original generation which devised the Constitution. We should rely on contemporary scientific evidence, for example, when considering normative change. Now, Fraser, it seems to me, does rely on contemporary evidence when she argues that fundamental socioeconomic change is necessary to forestall catastrophic climate change. And she makes elaborate arguments on this in her latest works. Now, is she then a proponent of serial or sequential sovereignty if she is in effect arguing for establishing what might be termed vertical reciprocity with future generations, which would like to live in a society not devastated by catastrophic climate change, of course? Now, second, one of Fraser's central arguments is that we need to change the normative order regulating the economy in such a way that the fundamental issue of the investment of what she calls the social surplus is not left to private interests as it currently is in capitalism, which means that you have what she terms capital goods markets, through which it is decided how the social surplus will be invested, in what sorts of developmental projects, in what sorts of research and development of productive capacities. And she argues that this fundamental issue in democratic societies must not be left to private interests, but should be a matter of democratic decision-making, and this can be done only with substantive restructuring of the normative order of the economic reproduction. Now, shouldn't that be a prime example of bringing the Constitution more in line with its original promise? That would be my questions, and now Milan.
Okay, thank you. So it's up to me to end the seminar, so I will try to be brief and to the point and not to take too long. So thank you, Marian, for your invitation to participate in the seminar, and thank you, Professor Ferrara, for the opportunity to discuss your book. I think that it raises some very important questions for contemporary political theory, but I would also say political practice, as it reflects on some important problems that plague us in our political landscape. As Marian said, I will mostly reflect on the problem of populism in your book. So I think your criticism of populism is very powerful, as it points to some of its important weak points, and also points to some of its dangers that are prevalent today and have been obvious to many of us for some time, mostly in the West, but not only there. Your claim that populism equates the people with the electorate, or the people as they exist at a certain moment of time, and therefore in a way with constitutive power that is seen as unbound and unlimited, seems to me as a critique of a danger of the unregulated political power, and in a sense of an unregulated agency of a certain political subject that gives itself basically the right to make and unmake the rules of the political game, as you call it. Although I definitely agree that this danger exists, I often wondered whether populism can be related, and I think it often is in history, with certain periods of profound social and economic crisis, where a certain historical system reaches its deadlocks, and therefore this calls for a political subject that is able to change this difficult situation. In other words, I don't think this is specifically like a mistake you make. I think that maybe it's a problem with political theory in general, that some extra political powers and actors, like economic or ideological actors and powers, can function in a oppressive way, while the political system functions as a regular liberal democracy that works normally, let's say, which therefore prevents the people from changing these systems. Therefore, populism, it seems to me, appears as a way of harvesting agency, which is able to change the rules of the political game, as you call it, in order to defend or rise against these oppressive systems. For example, the civil rights movement in the US or the women's movement, they definitely didn't respect the rules of liberal democracy and often used violence for their purposes. Or, for example, can we look at the South American populist regimes in this way, which have often appeared as a reaction to difficult economic situations, often brought about by, let's say, economic imperialist interventions from the US. So my question to you is whether you think populism can be seen maybe as what Agamben calls destitutive power, or a kind of a correction to the political order that appears on those during those situations when the regular workings of democratic institutions can't influence those factors, these oppressive systems that people at a certain period find troubling, and that maybe it can be seen as this kind of harvesting of this political agency during these difficult situations where maybe people feel that working through liberal democratic institutions just isn't enough.
Yeah. Thanks, Milan. So, once again, Alessandro.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, it is. Starting from the latest remark, yes, every populism is a destitutive power in the sense that it brings about a challenge to constituted power, to the constituted powers, and therefore it has this this impact. I'm not sure, though, that in fact you can't retrospectively read a hidden constitutive principle, even though the subjective perception of the actors is destitutive power. I'm not sure that you can't, in fact, carve that out from an interpretive point, that there's a latent, let's put it this way, there's a latent constitutive claim underneath there. distributive power. So that distributive power is what appears to be the case. Okay, and to Marian, thanks for the double challenge, the turning the tables on the liberals, saying that the liberals are guilty of the same mistakes of the populists. That's an interesting, challenging objection. It is certainly true when it comes to presumptively justified intolerance. You can think of there's a number of examples from the bunch of deplorables that it starts with the scum of the earth of Duke Wellington, using that expression to define his own army, some of his own people in the army, all the way to the bunch of deplorables, or think of the French ban on the scarf as a way of legislatively entrench, so to speak, that negative judgments on cultural expression. So intolerance to ways of being, ways of articulating subjectivity that are not in line with what you think proper. So certainly there's a liberal sin of intolerance to traditional forms of life. We were speaking earlier of Jonathan Kwong, and there's an element of that in saying, well, these people who are not reasonable, working with the strong dichotomy, rigid dichotomy, binary of reasonable, unreasonable, as though there weren't degrees in between, and saying you're not even the addressees of justification. So there's certainly that. But on the other hand, I think that liberal thinkers are kind of by definition defenders of a strong notion of rights that are to be perpetual in Jeffersonian terminology, the transgenerational. So they can't. I find it difficult to associate them with the idea of the present generation being endowed with full constituent power. In fact, I mean, the Jeffersonian view and the Rousseauian view, they're perceived as champions of radical democratic as opposed to liberal. So there is a kind of hijacking of radical democratic thought by populism, but hardly a liberal one. So checks and balances are never a populist proposition. Checks and balances, separation of powers. These are the strongholds of the liberal approach to democratic government. Those are never appropriated by populist movements. So that's the core. That's the liberal core, which is more resistant somehow against hijacking by populist movements. Then there is the issue of sequentialism. You mentioned the dissenting opinion of the justices. I think it was Scalia and others in Obergefell, saying we're interpreting more in a way what has always been the case, the sequential transgenerational view of the family and what is a proper family, and you are a Jacobin type, exerting a Jacobin type interventionism on that, based on abstract's idea of rights. You're creating law as opposed to you're imposing your own view of marriage. All right. But I think a Rawlsian political liberal response to that challenge is to distinguish substantive sequentialism. Substantive sequentialism meaning the transgenerational persistence of certain ethical stances or views of the good, from the political sequentialism, the preservation of the political project of the people. And the name conservatism, to me, the term conservatism applies to the former. So the idea is that there is a transgenerational continuity of custom or ideas of the good, which has nothing to do or very little to do with the sequentialism of a political liberal kind, which is the persistence of a political project, rather than which can accommodate very different ideas of the good along the way, sequentially, but also contextually. There could be rival views of the good in the same time. But what is continuous there is an idea of democratic sovereignty, the basics like majority rule, again, separation of powers, pluralism, party pluralism, all of that. You have a number of procedural constants, as well as constants that have to do with rights, but not so much cultural continuity. So the justices who claimed that the opinion violated the feelings of the majority of the voters were invoking to me, they were invoking a conservative cultural type sequentialism rather than a political liberal sequentialism, whereas the other side, those who wrote the opinion, they said, well, we have equal treatment, equal protection of the laws. If you have that, that's the thing we should be in continuity with, equal protection. And if you have a right scripted in the Constitution and by interpretation extended to new facts of the matter, you don't have to wait and hope for the political stars to align, which they may or may not, depending on the electoral fortunes of candidates, parties, and so on. You have a right, and the court gives it to you on the basis of. So what the court does until an amendment that rectifies that opinion is duly ratified, what the court does is saying, not imposing their own enlightened-driven opinion, but saying, well, I thought we all shared this political project, and we are entrusted by the institutional system to say what is within the project and what is without, beyond the project, what violates the project. And we're saying it is within. Same-sex marriage is within the project. So that wouldn't be, in my opinion, a violation of continuity at all. It would be the affirmation of continuity, although it is a break in cultural continuity, in the substantive type transgenerational continuity of what people have always thought the family was. And now, more in line with original promise. More in line with original promise is as contested a concept as the original promise is. So the uncertainty or openness, or let's say indeterminacy of original promise is a function of how wide the range of plausible interpretations of the original intent of the Constitution is. The Constitution of my country has at Article 1, Italy is a democratic republic founded on labor. What does founded on labor means? It was actually a compromise between those who wanted a republic of the workers, the Communist Party, and the and the mainstream liberals who wanted nothing. So Italy is a democratic republic. So the mediation operated by a Christian Democrat like Fanfani was to say, founded on labor, which was acceptable to both. But what does that mean? It's Article 1. So that is the best rendition is to say it is an affirmation of the priority of labor over property. Constitutions are meant to protect property, but before there is property, property is congealed labor. Go to Locke, for instance, on the property's natural right. So labor comes first, and then property is crystallized labor that needs defense and all that we know. But in principle, there is labor. In the beginning was labor, and now that has some normative power on grounding social rights. Of course, it does, and it's invoked, but it's vague, and it's a way of formulating by a people, duly represented by those who were elected to the Constitutional Assembly, blah blah blah. But for shorthand, saying the people had a kind of pretty, how should I say, not the opposite of fine grain, the kind of large grained project that based on so fidelity to that is also equally open to contestation. Now to Nancy Fraser. Yeah, the challenge, if I understand correctly, is to say, why isn't vertical reciprocity better served by the idea of preventing a catastrophic climate change from happening through the necessary legislative and constitutional changes that need to be introduced? Why isn't the vertical reciprocity to future generation better served by that?
Basically, the context-dependent nature of this particular case, where scientific evidence might point in the direction that even a substantive transformation of certain constitutional essentials is necessary for the purpose of vertical reciprocity. That was the kind of question.
Yeah. Well, I think the issue there is dual. One is what is gained by calling this a leftist populist position, as opposed to an intervention in this liberal democratic debate about constitutional amendments. Because she is one of those, along with Chantal Mouffe, who invests on the terms, saying we should have our own version of a view that represents the 99%. Okay, we should, and necessarily is broad. One question is what is to be gained conceptually there from that. And the other aspect is the status of the proposal. Because there's no objection in thinking of this as a proposal to be discussed in a ideal or non-ideal debate about constitutional amendments that are necessary to allow that change. So it's the articulation of one political view, one political argument. It is a different thing if you say you construct a counter-hegemonic bloc that if it gains some kind of institutional power, then enforces this. I take the first one is tame, it's no problem, but there's no point in calling it in injecting in it the flavor of this kind of antagonistic thing. There's no difference from articulating one position within the normal palette of political arguments. And if the other one, then you do have a problem with acceptance of pluralism. Then you have the institutional, you're wishing for the for having enough political power to institutionalize something that rides on something other than consent, which is a problem. But I knowing the author, also same thing with Chantal Mouffe. I think they're deeply committed liberal Democrats who will never venture into something like that. So it's more in the sense of it's more in the direction of a kind of tame advocacy of certain things. But certainly the point remains that she urges us to rethink the promise of the Constitution in critical terms. All right, that's the best I can do. And
right, it's perfect. It's perfect. So we've reached the end of today's discussion. Somehow, yeah. And of course, it could go on for a long time. There's so many things. I would have had plenty more questions, of course, and I assume everybody else would as well. But I think it was very, very fruitful and comprehensive and far-reaching in many respects, and constitutes a real kind of elaboration and continuation of the discussion we had a decade ago, I would say. So let me just conclude by thanking all the participants who by now are quite tired, as well as the audience. Thanks for staying. And finally, I would like to thank Alessandro for responding very, very thoroughly to all interventions. And we will definitely have episode 3 at some point. I'm pretty sure.
Thank you all for the invitation, the patience to follow this, and the friendship of